John chapter 2, verses 13 through 22. Listen for the word of the Lord. The Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons, and the money changers at their business. And making a whip of cords, he drove them all with the sheep and oxen out of the temple. And he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And he told those who sold the pigeons, "Take these things away. You shall not make my Father's house a house of trade." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for thy house will consume me." The Jews then said to him, "What sign have you to show us for doing this?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you will raise it up in 3 days?" But he spoke of the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word Jesus had spoken. Our second scripture reading comes from Mark chapter 11, verses 12 through 25. On the following day, when they came from Bethany, he was hungry. And seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to see if he could find anything on it. He is Jesus here. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. And he said to it, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard it. And they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold and who bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. And he taught and said to them, Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations? But you have made it a den of robbers." And the chief priests and the scribes heard it and sought a way to destroy him, for they feared him, because all the multitude was astonished at his teaching. And when evening came, they went out of the city. As they passed by in the morning, they saw the fig tree withered at its roots. And Peter remembered and said to him, "Master, look, the fig tree which you cursed has withered." And Jesus answered them, "Have faith in God. Truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, 'Be taken up and cast into the sea,' and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says will come to pass, it will be done for him. Therefore I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you will receive it, and you will. And whenever you stand praying, forgive if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father also, who is in heaven, may forgive your trespasses." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
So before we start in for today, I wonder if anyone remembered to bring the stuff for the collage this week. So your question last week that I asked was to bring something that spoke to you about taking up your cross. Bill gets the special award today. Did you bring something serious? Other people have them? There's no guilt here. Like, in case you didn't get that memo, at Grace Presbyterian Church, there really is no shame, okay? So it's just, if you have it, I want to hear about it. So what did you bring? What kind of pictures? And I'm going to invite you after the service to put it up on the collage. We're making a collage. Looks like our church here, right? There's a triangle, and then there's an octagon, and then this like a walkway between. So each week I'm giving you a question to find something in a magazine, or maybe it's a quote or a poem or something. to bring and fill in our collage based on what we're talking about during Lent, to kind of fill in what our church is like, or what our church should
It's
be like.
not a picture. I started to draw a picture, and then I realized I had the wrong question in mind. So I just wrote this. Picking up the cross would mean losing my self-centeredness and having closer spiritual contact with God, the desire and will to do God's will constantly.
To hear her, to let go of herself and get closer to God. So she'll put that back up on the wherever you would like later. What did you bring?
Well, I'm an overachiever, so I brought Tuesday.
Fantastic. So one of you could ask Leslie if you could borrow her, and it should go for a really high price.
And one of them is a picture from Google's version of poverty, saying everyone born a place at the table. I think, and I couldn't, basically I couldn't choose. So then I found a quote from Gandhi that says, "Poverty is the worst form of violence," and I tried to find a picture too.
So for you, it's about dealing with poverty
living in the world in lavish situation and seeing poverty and suffering all around,
yeah, yeah.
and not being able to know my place in the world.
So taking up her cross means to live in the lavishness that we live in all the time and know that there is poverty around us, and what do we do about that? Anyone else bring something? Mary Ellen, what's your
I chose a quote from the president's speech yesterday in Selma. And toward the beginning of the speech, he said, "The single most important word in a democracy is we." And I think because we're talking about being connected through, through Lent, that's our theme through Lent, that I think that for me, taking up my cross is being connected with each of you, and in doing so, thinking of us as we. I thought that was a really profound thought that he shared yesterday.
Thanks. What you got?
Well, as an old landscaper and gardener, I have to plant a garden is to believe in tomorrow.
Oh, okay, there you go. So to take up your cross, to plant a garden is to believe in tomorrow. Yeah.
A garden can mean many
It
things.
can mean, a garden can mean a lot of things, yeah. Anyone else on what your take your cross up means?
I didn't bring it in, but I have it in my mind, which is apropos for this quote. It is not by our thoughts, but by our actions that we are defined.
Not by our thoughts, but by our actions that we are defined, so taking up our cross. Did anyone else bring a visual, something to put up on the board? Did you bring something, Debbie?
Yes,
What'd you
I
bring?
did.
What'd you bring?
Well, I can't pick it up now.
Not your prayer request. Did you bring something for the collage? We're going to do the prayer request later.
I didn't know what to bring.
That's okay. Not everyone, you see, not everyone got it. It's all right. Anyone else? All right. Well, then we'll get into this week. So we read two versions of this story of Jesus overturning the tables, which I'm sure is a familiar story anyway. The temple, as we know, is a destination for Jewish people from all over the region and then even beyond. And some people traveled a long distance to worship at the temple. And all of these people required sacrifices to give to the priests. And they can't very well carry their pigeons or their doves or their sheep with them on long journeys. And so it was easier if they could purchase it once they arrived. And so let's consider the people who provide the sacrifices this morning, right? I want us to pretend that we are one of the vendors. And we sell pigeons and doves, which means we raise pigeons and doves for a living. This is what we do. We don't have to travel far to go to the temple because we live right there in town. In fact, our family and our livelihood is very much centered on the temple life. Right? Our children know the temple like the back of their hands. It is their second home. Now one day, we wake up as usual. We have our morning coffee. We read the paper. Our children are beginning to stir, but we are on our way out to the barn because we're going to check on our pigeons and our doves. So we check out our inventory and we see what we might have right now that would sell for sacrifices, we feed them and water them, and then we begin to pack up our cart to take into the temple to sell. It's a crisp morning, can you imagine? And so we make sure to wrap up with our scarves and maybe even put it over our ears as we're going. And our minds wander, like all of us on any commute to work, right? We think about the weather, we think about the news from last week, we wonder about the economy, we think about our children, and we kind of smile at the funny things they say. Like this week, our daughter asked us if we would help tie her shoes, and we said, well, what's the magic word? And with delight, she looked up and said, abracadabra. And so we turn the corner and we see, oh, there's Susanna, and she's on her front porch, she's getting her paper, and she's been recently widowed. Her husband turned ill and died suddenly, and she's actually quite young to be a widow. We wave, and she waves back, and we wonder, I don't really know how she's doing. So you make a mental note to ask your family if anyone knows about her situation. So we've finally gotten to the temple, and it's already bustling with noise and clanging of the various vendors, and we find our usual spot, right? It's by the others who sell birds for sacrifices. Now the man in the booth beside us is named Jonathan, and he always has bird jokes, and so you have to go through the daily ordeal. We shake hands, and then he asks, hey, how do you know when it's time to buy a bird? And so you ask, when? And he says, when it goes cheap. Cheap. Okay, wait, he's got another one. So he says, hey, how do you catch a unique bird? And you go, I don't know, Jonathan. And he says, unique up on it. Where is that ring out when you need it? So we check on the bird, and we take a seat, right? From where we sit, though, we can see across the way there is a bunch of tables, a row of tables that are set aside for those who exchange the money. Now, the men we call money changers were called the kalibistes, after a small Greek coin called the kalibos. Now, the rate of exchange was determined by the kalibos. Now, these men exchanged Greek and Roman money for Jewish or Tyrian coins, and then those coins could be used anywhere in the market for whatever they wanted, and of course they could also pay the temple tax. Oh, here they come, right? The money changers, the kalibistes. They always come together because you see they have a meeting beforehand where they discuss the rate of exchange for the day. Now the money changers come in through a different gate, and if you remember right, they come in through a gate where a man named Lucas lives. Now, Lucas lives there. He's homeless. He's been homeless since his parents died. His family used to live in your neighborhood also, like Susanna. And when Lucas was a young boy, he used to go up to house and hand everyone their newspaper. He wasn't allowed to have a paper route because he wasn't as smart as the other kids. He was kind of slow. So the paper boy would throw the paper close, but I don't know, a little bit after, Lucas must be right behind him, and he'd come house to house, and he'd hand you the paper, knock on your door. I remember that he didn't talk. We're not really sure what was wrong with him, or what wasn't right, but man, it's been a long time since we've seen Lucas. We wonder, maybe we wouldn't even recognize Lucas if we saw him. I wonder if Lucas even lives at that gate anymore. Now by Lucas's gate, there are different kinds of vendors because the temple has become really a large marketplace. It's a lot easier for people to purchase their sacrifices once they get to temple, and then it became obvious that why wouldn't you just do your regular shopping there if you're already there buying stuff for sacrifice, supply and demand and all. And so it makes a lot of sense. It's nice to be able to do your errands all in one place. And now for us, we sell birds, right? So we don't really do a lot of business other than sacrifice. But if we sold grain, for example, or wine or oil, then what's to stop us from selling grain for a sacrifice, but also grain for someone to make their bread for the week? Now, the vegetable tables are also close, kind of by the same gate where Lucas lives, and the money changers are kind of in between there, and that makes sense too. And where you sit, if you look, you can see Myra, and she's doing just that. She's selling her vegetables. She's a neighbor as well. She's selling her vegetables to the money changers, and then the money changers are going to sell them back to the vegetable merchants, right? Now we all know it's a racket, because Myra gets her $2 from the money changers, and then the money changers get another $2 from the vegetable vendors. But you see, everyone knows that's just how it is. That's how we do business, right? That's how business is not done directly with vendors. We have to go through the money changers. And that's how it is. They're the authority. They're like the central banking. Now, our first buyer finally has arrived. And so we turn to our birds and we pick out a small dove. And we cradle it and we pet the dove's head. And we see that there's a little black spot, a gray spot above his right eye. And so we kiss the dove. And we give it to our patron. And right about the time we're about to sit down, we hear this really loud noise from somewhere over there, and they're screaming. And when we look up, there are people, kind of a stampede of animals and people and even birds flying around, you realize, coming toward us. And there is this crazy man who is chasing them toward where the money changers are. And then he gets to where the money changers are, and he flips all of their tables over. And so there's coins clanging all around, and their ledgers are on the floor. And the money changers are scrambling to get up from their seat and not trip over it. And they're scared. You can see they're scared and they're shocked. And this crazy man now starts to turn to us, where we're selling our pigeons, and he says something about the temple becoming a place of business. And in a split second, he's much closer to us, and he's by one of the other bird vendors, and he's opened the cages and has let the birds go free. Now, we don't know if we should stand in between our cage and the madman, or if we should try to pack up really quickly and get out of here, or if we dare to engage the madman. But you realize, like, no one engages crazy people, because that's just not what you do. So you're here, and he comes at you, and right when he's about to reach around our table, we ask him, what is this all about? Trying to calm him down. Now he's angry, and you see it in his eyes. And he says again, the temple is my Father's home, and you have made it a marketplace. And we say, well, yes, but I mean, it makes sense, right? And we begin to tell him, everyone comes here to sacrifice, and so we've made the temple the center of our activities. And he says, no, you haven't. No, what you've done is made your activities the center of God's temple. You have become the center. Now, that's not really what he said, right? In the text that we read. What he said in Mark's gospel was, my house will be called a house of prayer for all people, but you have made it into a den for robbers. And in John's account, he says, take these things out of here. You've made my Father's house into a house of trade, is what we heard. What was his problem? I mean, really, Jesus, what was that all about? So let's look at it again. Maybe look at the various characters that I created in my telling. We have the vendors, that's us. And we have the money changers that were over there. And we have merchants, people coming in, buying and selling their vegetables. And now sprinkled in the story, though, are a few individuals. I don't know if you caught them, right? There was the widow, Susanna, the homeless man named Lucas, and Myra, selling her vegetables. Now, they are not written into the story, but those types of people were most definitely present in Jerusalem. Those types of people are most definitely present in our lives every day. Everyday life is always sprinkled with vulnerable people who often live on the margins. Vulnerable people who are often overlooked. For us, perhaps, it's the person who cleared the table at the last place you had lunch. Or maybe the elderly person driving slowly in front of us while we are on our way to work. Or maybe there's a young woman with Down syndrome who works at your shopping mart, your supermarket. Everyday life is always sprinkled with vulnerable people who are often overlooked. Some of those people we see, like the ones I just described, but some we don't see. Like, for example, what about the person who made the clothes you're wearing? I wonder what their life is like. Or how about the people who work at the recycling plant in New Brunswick? I wonder what their life is like. Now, I've chosen 2 pictures for our collage today. I admit that my printer stopped working. And so now I give you permission to draw pictures, which someone drew a picture. I drew a picture of someone crying, because I think one of the people groups that I think are vulnerable and often overlooked are people who are grieving. And I'm going to put these on the margins of our drawings. And then the second thing I brought is a family, and one of the children is in a wheelchair. And so I made it a family because it's not just disabled people or people who have special needs that I think are on the margins, but I think the whole family is often found on the margins. Now, I could have drawn all kinds of things, right? And so my question for you, right, is where do you see that there are people who are vulnerable and often are overlooked, right? So my picture, and just to say a little more, is that the grieving picture is because I think that there are so few places in our culture where we actually can express grief, that instead most of us interact with people who have grief that is mismanaged. And as a result, they are aggressive, depressed, and often addicted, and a lot of other things. But there's so few places where you can really be honest about your grief. Not just of people in your life who have died, but grief. Grief at the loss of a job, grief at a new stage of life that you don't know how to go into that season, grief of having your children not come out how you want, grief of how your career doesn't come out how you want. We grieve, we don't have places to be honest about that. And then my second picture, like I said, is that I think that families who have people with special needs, which we discovered in our special needs classes, they all have special needs, it's just different, right? But there are a lot of families who feel like they're not welcome in places, and kind of rightfully so, because they don't fit a mold, right? Even in church, special needs families know they're not really welcome unless we tell them overtly, unless we make some changes, unless we adapt. Because otherwise they don't fit, right? I mean, where does a wheelchair go? Or what if my kid can't sit still? Right? And they know. So everyday life is always sprinkled with vulnerable people who are often overlooked. And so we, like those at the temple, I think have grown accustomed to the way life is. Now our practices might not be righteous. We might know we should be more welcoming, or we should understand people, or we should allow people to grieve, we should do these things, but it's just how it is, right? I mean, that's how it is. And when Jesus entered the scene on that very normal day in the temple, what was accepted as normal, he says, is no longer acceptable. Why? Why was it no longer acceptable to Jesus? And how does he possibly communicate that to anyone? Maybe that's why he overturned tables. When Jesus was looking at their normal life, if you can stick with me, I think he was looking through a different lens. And this is the lens that I read. In 1968, Father Pedro Arrupe called this lens the preferential option for the poor. This phrase was then adopted by a Latin American theologian named Gutierrez. And he created a form of theology called liberation theology. Liberation theology concentrates on seeing Christ as the liberator, not only from sin, but from whatever oppresses us. So the preferential option for the poor then asserts that our words and our prayers and our deeds always must show solidarity with and compassion for the poor. Let me say that again. The preferential option for the poor says that our words and our prayers and our deeds need to show solidarity with and compassion for the poor. So accordingly, this doctrine, this idea of liberation theology, implies that the moral test of any society is how it treats its most vulnerable members. The moral test of any society is how it treats its most vulnerable members. And so go back with me to our table with our pigeons and our doves. Because now they're flying about, and coins are clanking on the floor. The tables are overturned, and I want you to look up, and I want you to see the madman called Jesus, the Christ, the liberator of pigeons that day. And I want us to hear him ask us, Grace Presbyterian Church, how do you treat the most vulnerable members? That is the test of our righteousness.